Today we're working on this 2014 Dodge Grand Caravan with a 3.6 liter in it, and we're going to be replacing a pretty common issue on it, which is going to be the oil filter housing and cooler assembly, which is located back here. Now, in order to remove this and replace it with the new unit, there's quite a few steps involved, and to get started, the first thing we're going to need to do is disconnect the battery. We're also going to drain the coolant, and then we need to do a fuel pressure relief procedure on it. Now that's going to include removing the gas cap and disconnecting the fuel pump module and then starting the vehicle until it shuts off and won't start again. And the reason we need to do that is there is a lot of high pressure fuel that will run through the rail that's underneath everything that we're going to be removing, and we don't want to have that high pressure fuel still built up when it comes time to disconnect the fuel line from the rail. And we'll show you that process here in just a moment. Now this is a big job to accomplish, but it is going to be a lot easier and go a lot faster if we use a quality drop-in replacement like this one from Standard, which is going to be the entire assembly. And it's going to come completely assembled. It's going to include the upper and lower manifold gaskets that we're going to have to take off to get to the assembly. It's even going to include a new oil temperature sensor and new oil pressure sensor at the end here, along with obviously a new cooler, new hardware. It's going to have the new cap and a new filter inside as well. And then you're going to have your seals on the bottom ready to go. So that way, whenever this is dropped in, installed, we know we're not going to have any leaks. We're going to have accurate readings from our sensors, and we're going to have proper cooling and proper filtration because we have the correct cooler and we have the correct oil filter. And it is important that we make sure we install an assembly that is built and cataloged for the vehicle we're working on. There are universal options like this out there. Sometimes, however, though, they do call for a different filter than what the vehicle came with, and that's going to make it harder for the customer down the road to get oil changes done. So we want to make sure we get the correct assembly for the vehicle, and we want to make sure that it's going to have the right filter in it as well. So the first thing we need to do after we get the other procedures taken care of is remove this cover, and then we can show you some of the steps that are going to be required to get this job done. And so with the cover removed and our coolant drained, and we now know that we don't have any fuel pressure built up, we can now see this is where the housing is, the assembly that we're going to be removing. And so in order to get here, there's quite a few steps we need to take. One, we need to remove the upper and lower portion of the intake assembly. And really, there's quite a few things, not necessarily all the way in our way, but will make our life a lot easier if we just remove. So we're going to do the upper and lower portion of the intake, as well as remove the throttle body and the air cleaner assembly, get all of that out of the way. And then once those items are freed and out of our view here, you'll see that we have direct access to this assembly. And really, it's just a matter of a few bolts that we've got to take out and a few connections that have to be removed to take this completely out of the vehicle and replace it with a new one. So what we'll do is we'll remove the air cleaner assembly, we will get the throttle body off, we'll get the upper and lower portion of the intake off, and then you'll be able to see we'll have complete access to the assembly, and we'll show you how to remove that. Now that we have the intake manifold removed, we also have the air intake assembly removed, again along with the throttle body that was sitting over here, and pretty much everything out of the way. We can see we have much closer access to the filter housing and cooler assembly, but we have one thing left in the way, and that's going to be our plenum. Now, there are 8 bolts that are going to have to be removed for this plenum, and it's not going to be the ones on the top here. We don't want to remove these. We want to go over here around the outer edge of the plenum, and there are 8 of these. One here, 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 and here. So we have 8 of these total, and this is going to be a Torx T20 that's going to remove these bolts. So you just need to grab you a ratchet, throw your Torx T20 on here, remove these bolts, and once this plenum comes out of the way, we're going to have complete access to not only the filter housing, but also the cooler assembly of the rest of the entire assembly itself. So one last note that we will make here, once we get the plenum off, if we just pull the oil filter housing and cooler assembly right away, there's going to be a lot of oil left in here, and that's going to create a pretty good mess over here. So what we actually want to do is we want to remove the cap before we pull the assembly and remove the filter. There's a drain back valve in here, and what will happen is once we remove that, the oil will drain back down to the pan, and once we pull the assembly, it won't have as much oil dripping all over the place. So that's just a quick tip for you. Go ahead and just remove the cap, pull the filter, and get that oil drain back down before you pull the entire assembly. And now with all of the bolts released, we can take our plenum and pull straight up. And there we have it. Now our kit does come with new gaskets for the plenum. We're going to make sure we replace those gaskets when we put this back on after the cooler assembly is done. And as you can see, when we pulled the plenum, we also pulled the fuel rail along with the fuel injectors at the same time. So that's why we did the fuel pressure release at the same time as we did the coolant dump at the beginning of this process. Just in case there was some high pressure fuel left in, we didn't want to have that cause us a problem when we pulled the plenum and disconnected our fuel rail. And so now the next steps in the process, we have 2 electrical connectors we're going to need to disconnect here. No issues there, we'll just pull those pigtails off. We have 1 hose that's going to be connected to the assembly. We'll remove that hose at the back. And then we have 5 bolts that are holding this assembly on. And now we use the Torx T20 to remove the plenum. We're now going to use an inverted Torx E8 to remove the bolts for the assembly. Now there are 5 of these. There are 2 right here in front of the cooler. There's also 1 tucked back here behind where the neck is, and then we have 2 closer to the front. We're not going to remove the cooler. There are bolts that hold that on, but this is all coming off as one assembly. So we're just going to remove these 5 bolts with the E8, and then once we have those removed, we have our pigtails removed and our hose removed, we'll be able to pull this entire assembly right out from the top. And again, having done the oil filter cap, we won't have nearly as much oil draining back onto us and onto the motor itself when we move and pull this out of the way. And so as you can see, we also went ahead and taped off our intake ports. We didn't want to take the chance of one of these bolts that we're removing from the assembly falling down inside when we remove it. So just to be precautious, we went ahead and did that. And now we're going to be able to pull the assembly straight up. We have those 5 bolts removed. The only thing that's still attached is going to be the coolant hose. And the only reason it's still attached is it's going to be easier for us to get a pair of pliers on that clamp that's holding the coolant hose on. So we'll pull straight up on the housing, and then we'll pull that coolant hose off, and we'll be able to pull the entire housing away, and then we'll be able to install a new one. And there we have it. So now, again, what I was showing earlier, prior to placing the new assembly in, we've gone ahead and lubricated our O-rings. Doesn't have to do it a whole lot, just a little bit, so that when we place it down into the valley, it's not going to get crimped or cut or anything like that. Prior to actually setting it in the valley, we'll go ahead and put that coolant hose back on so that that makes our job a little bit easier. And so with the coolant hose attached, we can now put our pigtails on, but we also need to torque these bolts down, these 5 bolts that are holding the assembly on. And so our order is going to be, the first bolt to be torqued will be the one right here, closest to the neck. Then we're going to go to the front, closest to the front of the vehicle. That's going to be our second bolt. Our third bolt will be back here on this side of the filler. Then our fourth, the other side of the front of the housing. And then our fifth over on the back side of the housing here. And so in that order, we'll torque these down to 106 inch-pounds. And once that's torqued down, it's just a series and process of putting everything back together that we've taken off. Now remember, we had new gaskets that came with our plenum, and for our intake, we want to make sure we use those new gaskets whenever we put everything back together. So those will be utilized. And then once we get everything back together, we'll get this vehicle started up and make sure we've got everything connected, everything's working right, we don't have any codes, and we don't have any issues with this new installation. So now with the assembly reinstalled and the bolts torqued down to the right specifications, we can now go in and put the lower portion of our intake, the plenum, back in place. And you can see we've already put our new gaskets on the bottom side as well as the top side. And when we install this, when we put it back down, just like with the oil filter housing and cooling assembly, these also have a specific series in which they want you to torque them down. And it's going to go as follows. You're going to start here on the front side, close to the engine. This is going to be the first bolt that you're going to torque down, and then all the way to the end will be the second bolt that you torque down. Then you'll come up and do your third bolt here, fourth bolt here, fifth bolt here, sixth here, seventh here, and then finally your eighth bolt here. And so that'll be the series in which you will torque these bolts down to the 106 inch-pounds. So again, one more time: first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth. Once you get that series done and torqued down to 106 inch-pounds, we're then going to have to do the bolts for the upper portion of the intake to 89 inch-pounds, and I'll show you that series next. Now, prior to bolting this down, it'll be easier if I show you from the top side of this which bolts go in which sequence. Now again, these are to 89 inch-pounds, and the series that you will want to torque these down will be first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and then seventh. And once we've got that down, we now know that we have the entire intake assembly torqued down to the right specification and in the right sequence, and the oil filter assembly with the cooler torqued down to the right specifications, and we shouldn't have any problems with that series of parts performing and functioning correctly when we get this completely back put together and back out on the road and running. So it is important to follow those sequences and get those torque specifications correct before you put anything else back onto the vehicle. Now it's just a matter of getting the air cleaner assembly back together, the throttle body back on, and all the remaining miscellaneous components that we removed to get down to the intake and get down to the oil filter and cooler assembly. And hopefully now you have a better understanding of how this process works, and you can get this done in your own garage a lot quicker and a lot easier than before.